Welcome to BookBound Audio, where stories come alive in the power of words and sound. Today, prepare yourself for a journey into the unknown as we unravel a chilling tale of mystery, courage, and the paranormal. Set against the haunting backdrop of Route 66 in 1962, The Forgotten Highway will lead you into the depths of suspense and darkness, where the whispers of the past refuse to stay silent. So sit back, relax, or don't, and immerse yourself in this spine-tingling audio experience. Let the shadows of the Forgotten Highway take hold. The hum of the old Plymouth's engine was a steady companion as we tore down the desolate stretch of Route 66. Even with all the windows rolled down, the muggy summer air clung to my skin like an unwelcome shroud. Elliot Brooks sat to my left, hands firm on the wheel, his eyes squinting out into the endless horizon. He hadn't said much since we left the diner back in Tucumcari, but that wasn't unusual. Elliot was a man of quiet contemplation, his thoughts an impenetrable maze I rarely ventured into. I'd learned to read the signs, though, the way his fingers tapped absently on the steering wheel or how his jaw tightened when he was mentally piecing something together. Right now, his knuckles were pale, gripping the wheel as if it might suddenly escape his hands. Something about this case had him spooked, though he would never admit it outright. And truthfully, I felt it too, a weight in the pit of my stomach, like we were driving into the maw of something vast and unknowable. "Do you feel it?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. My voice sounded strained, unnatural against the backdrop of the car's rhythmic rumble. Elliot glanced at me briefly, his expression unreadable. "Feel what?" "This?" "I don't know," I said, groping for words. "It's like the air is heavier out here. Doesn't it feel different to you?" His lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "You're imagining things, Miguel. Probably the heat getting to you." I knew better than to press him. Elliot had always been skeptical of my sensitivity to things others might dismiss as folklore or coincidence. It was, ironically, one of the reasons we worked so well together. Where I brought context, history, and a dash of superstition, he cut through the noise with cool logic and precision. Still, this was different, and I could tell even he wasn't entirely convinced by his own dismissal. The road ahead stretched on in a straight, unwavering line, flanked on either side by flat, unbroken plains. The monotony of the scenery was disorienting, as if we were caught in a loop, driving endlessly without ever truly arriving anywhere. I pulled out a notebook from the glove compartment, flipping through pages filled with my scrawling handwriting. Names, dates, and locations jumbled together in a chaotic map of connections I was still trying to untangle. "The last disappearance was just over 2 weeks ago," I said, more to myself than to Elliot. "A salesman from Arizona. His car was found abandoned at a rest stop about 10 miles from here." 10 miles, Elliot repeated, his voice low and thoughtful. "And no sign of him?" I shook my head. "Nothing. Not a single footprint, no evidence of a struggle. It's like he just vanished." Elliot nodded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. "And you're sure about the legend? The path of no return?" The name sent a shiver down my spine, though I tried to hide it. "It's an old story," I said carefully. "Passed down through the Apache tribes in this region. They say there's a place where the veil between worlds is thin, where those who wander too far are swallowed up by the land itself. But it's more than that, it's tied to something darker. Betrayal, desecration, a curse." Elliot grunted, his way of acknowledging without committing to belief. "Sounds like a convenient explanation for some very human crimes." "Maybe," I admitted. But if that's the case, why hasn't anyone ever found a body? Or any evidence at all, for that matter? His silence was answer enough. Whatever he believed, Elliot had learned to trust my instincts, even if he didn't fully understand them. And my instincts were screaming that this was no ordinary case. Elliot killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. "Stay close," he said, stepping out of the car with the fluid grace of a predator. I followed, clutching my notebook like a talisman. The door creaked on rusted hinges as we entered, the dim interior reeking of dust and stale air. A lone figure emerged from the shadows, a wiry man with deep-set eyes and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He regarded us with suspicion, his gaze lingering on Elliot's tailored trench coat before shifting to my sweat-streaked shirt and dusty boots. "Help you," he drawled, his voice rough as gravel. Elliot stepped forward, his demeanor calm but commanding. "We're looking for information about a man who disappeared around here recently. You might have heard about it, a salesman from Arizona." The man's expression didn't change, but I caught the briefest flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Can't say I know nothing about that," he said, taking a long drag from his cigarette. Elliot didn't miss a beat. "We're not here to cause trouble. Just trying to piece together what happened. Maybe you've seen something unusual? Strange lights, sounds, anything out of the ordinary." The man hesitated, his gaze darting to the window as if expecting someone, or something, to be watching. "This ain't a place you wanna be poking around in," he said finally. "Ain't safe, especially after dark." "What makes it unsafe?" I asked, stepping forward despite the tightening in my chest. He shot me a look that made my stomach churn. "You really don't want to know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Best you turn back now while you still can." Before we could press him further, the sound of a car approaching drew our attention. Headlights pierced the dimness, illuminating the station in stark relief. The man stiffened, his cigarette falling to the floor as he backed away. "Time to go," he muttered, disappearing into the back room without another word. Elliot and I exchanged a glance, the unspoken understanding between us louder than any words. Whatever we were dealing with, it was watching us now. And it didn't want us here. The sound of the car engine faded behind us as we trudged into the dim light of dusk. The air was thick with the kind of silence that wasn't entirely natural, the oppressive stillness that makes your ears strain for a sound that never comes. Elliot walked a few paces ahead, his tall figure cutting a shadow against the amber sky. His trench coat swayed with each purposeful step, a silhouette of determination that I had come to rely on, especially in places like this. The gas station clerk's warning still rattled in my mind. "Ain't safe, especially after dark." The words felt like a challenge, and I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Something about his voice, low, almost reverent, had stirred an instinct in me that whispered we were poking at something best left undisturbed. "Where are we headed, exactly?" I asked, adjusting my pace to match Elliot's. "To the rest stop where the salesman's car was found," he replied without looking back. His voice was steady, but there was a tension in it, an edge that hinted at the wheels turning in his head. "I want to see if there's anything the local authorities overlooked." I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure how I felt about scouring the scene of yet another disappearance. We had done this dance before, time and time again, in towns and cities across the country. But this case, this place, it felt different. The air was charged with something I couldn't quite name, as if the land itself was watching, waiting. As we walked, the landscape stretched out around us, barren and unyielding. The remains of an old wooden sign jutted crookedly from the earth, its weathered letters barely legible: Route 66, Scenic Byway. Scenic wasn't the word I would have chosen. The grass was dry and brittle underfoot, and the few trees that dotted the horizon were twisted and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. You ever heard the phrase of "the silence is deafening"? I asked, trying to lighten the mood. The word sounded hollow even to my own ears. Elliot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stopped suddenly and crouched down, his fingers brushing over a patch of dirt by the roadside. "Look at this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I moved closer, squinting in the fading light. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just a patch of earth darker than the rest. But as I knelt beside him, the faint outline of something became clear, a partial footprint, pressed deep into the soil. "It's old," I said, studying the edges. "Could be from anyone." Elliot shook his head. "The depth suggests it's recent. Maybe a day or two, no more." A shiver ran down my spine. "Think it's connected?" "Possibly," he said, rising to his feet. "Let's keep moving." We reached the rest stop just as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. The place was little more than a dilapidated picnic area, a rusted metal table and a couple of wooden benches, both covered in graffiti and bird droppings. The salesman's car had long since been towed, but the faint outline of tire tracks remained, leading into the gravel lot like ghostly echoes of what had been. "This is where they found it," Elliot said, his eyes scanning the area. "What do you see?" I hesitated, glancing around. The rest stop was eerily empty, surrounded by open plains that seemed to stretch forever. The trees were sparse and misshapen, their silhouettes casting long, spindly shadows in the moonlight. Something about the place felt wrong, as if the air was thicker here, heavier. "It's too quiet," I said finally. "Even for a place like this." No birds, no insects, nothing. Elliot nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Exactly. Nature abhors a vacuum. If there's silence, it's because something is keeping everything else at bay." The word sent a chill through me, but before I could respond, a faint sound reached my ears. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat, a low, rhythmic hum, like the whisper of wind through hollow reeds. "Do you hear that?" I asked, turning to Elliot. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's coming from over there." He pointed toward a cluster of trees just beyond the rest stop, their branches swaying gently despite the stillness of the air. Without waiting for my response, he began walking toward them, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel. I hesitated for a moment, then followed, clutching my notebook like it could somehow shield me from whatever we were walking into. As we approached the trees, the hum grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't natural, of that much I was certain. It sounded almost mechanical, yet there was a resonance to it that made my skin crawl, as if the sound itself was alive, pulsing and shifting in ways that defied logic. "What is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Elliot didn't answer. He stepped closer to the largest tree, his hand brushing against its rough bark. For a moment, he stood still, his head tilted as if listening to something just beyond my range of hearing. Then, without warning, he stepped back and drew his flashlight from his coat pocket, shining it at the base of the tree. The beam illuminated something carved into the bark, a symbol, intricate and unfamiliar. It was a circle, surrounded by jagged lines that radiated outward like the rays of a twisted sun. At the center was an eye, its pupil a black void that seemed to drink in the light. "Have you seen this before?" Elliot asked, his voice low. I shook my head, my throat suddenly dry. "No, but it looks ancient. Like something out of a ritual." "Take a sketch," he said, gesturing toward my notebook. My hands trembled as I flipped to an empty page and began to draw, my pencil scratching feverishly against the paper. The hum seemed to grow louder with each stroke, vibrating through my bones until I thought I might scream. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest. Elliot was staring at something behind me, his eyes narrowed and his body tense. Slowly, I turned to follow his gaze. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by shadow. For a moment, neither of us moved, the air between us crackling with unspoken tension. "Who's there?" Elliot called out, his voice steady but firm. The figure didn't respond. It stood motionless, its presence an oppressive weight that seemed to seep into the very ground beneath our feet. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving nothing but an eerie silence in its wake. Elliot exhaled slowly, lowering the flashlight. "We're not alone out here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my mind racing with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. Whatever was happening on this cursed stretch of road, it was far from over. The night chill crept in slowly, a biting wind slicing through my jacket as we made our way back to the car. My footsteps felt heavy, each crunch of gravel underfoot amplified against the oppressive silence. I couldn't shake the image of that figure from my mind, motionless, shadowed, and gone as quickly as it had appeared. Elliot, ever the stoic, seemed unaffected, his expression unreadable as always. I wished I could share his resolve, but my thoughts swirled with unease. We drove in silence for a while, the headlights carving shallow pools of light in the darkness. Beyond their reach, the landscape was swallowed whole, the shadows yawning wide like some ancient beast. I clutched my notebook, its rough pages a reminder of the things we'd seen and the questions that still loomed. The sketch of the symbol glared up at me in the dim light of the car. The jagged lines and piercing eye seemed almost alive, mocking me with their mystery. "We're not heading back to town, are we?" I asked finally, my voice hoarse from the tension. "No," Elliot replied without taking his eyes off the road. "I want to check something first." I raised an eyebrow, though I doubted he could see it in the dark. "What's something?" "There's an old survey map I came across before we left. It shows an abandoned homestead not far from here. I have a hunch it might be connected." "A hunch?" I said, half joking. "You usually make fun of me for those." For a brief moment, I thought I saw the corner of his mouth twitch into a smile, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Let's just say this place has me second-guessing some of my usual conclusions. I wasn't sure if that was comforting or terrifying. The car rumbled onto a dirt path, the tires kicking up clouds of dust that swirled like phantoms in the rearview mirror. The path was narrow and uneven, flanked by tall grasses that swayed in the night breeze. It felt as though we were being funneled toward something, as though the land itself was guiding us. The trees grew denser as we drove on, their twisted limbs arching over the path like skeletal sentinels. When we finally came to a stop, the headlights illuminated a crumbling structure nestled among the trees. The homestead was barely standing, its roof sagging and its walls pockmarked with decay. It looked as though it had been abandoned for decades, yet there was something about it that felt strangely occupied. Elliot killed the engine, and we stepped out into the frigid air. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it faint whispers that I couldn't quite decipher. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake off the chill that had settled deep in my bones. "You think someone still lives here?" I asked, my voice barely louder than a whisper. "Doubtful," Elliot said, striding toward the house with that unshakable confidence of his. "But I think someone, or something, has been here recently." The door creaked ominously as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty structure. I followed close behind, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness. The interior was as dilapidated as the exterior. Dusty furniture lay overturned, and the floorboards creaked under our weight. Faded wallpaper clung to the walls like the remnants of a forgotten era, its floral patterns barely discernible beneath layers of grime. Elliot moved methodically, scanning the room with the precision of a surgeon. I trailed behind, trying not to let my imagination get the better of me. Every shadow seemed to shift, every creak of the floorboards a potential threat. The whispers on the wind were louder now, though they seemed to fade the moment I tried to focus on them. "Over here," Elliot said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. He was kneeling by a hearth at the far end of the room, his flashlight trained on something etched into the stone. I stepped closer, my stomach churning as I recognized the same symbol I had sketched earlier, the circle, the jagged lines, the eye. "It's the same one," I said, my voice barely audible. "What do you think it means?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook of his own, flipping through the pages with practiced ease. He stopped at a section filled with neatly written notes and diagrams, his brow furrowing in concentration. "It's a binding symbol," he said finally, his tone laced with unease. "Used in rituals to trap or contain something, usually something dangerous." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "So, what happens when the symbol starts appearing in multiple places?" Elliot looked at me, his expression grim. "It means whatever was bound is no longer contained." Before I could respond, a sudden noise shattered the silence, a sharp, metallic clanging that echoed through the house like a gunshot. I jumped, my heart racing as I turned toward the source. The sound had come from the back of the house, where the shadows were deepest. Elliot was already moving, his flashlight cutting a path through the darkness. I hesitated for a moment, then followed, my pulse pounding in my ears. We moved cautiously, each step deliberate and measured. The air grew colder the further we went, and the whispers seemed to grow louder, more distinct. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were words, fragmented and overlapping, spoken in a language I couldn't understand. We reached what appeared to be a kitchen, though it was barely recognizable. The counters were coated in a thick layer of dust, and the cabinets hung open, their contents long since pillaged. The clanging noise came again, louder this time, and I realized it was coming from beneath us. "A basement," Elliot said, scanning the room with his flashlight. I spotted a small door in the corner, its edges warped with age. Elliot moved toward it, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife he always kept at his side. He opened the door cautiously, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air that wafted up from below was damp and foul, carrying with it a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, my instinct screaming at me to turn back. But Elliot was already descending, his flashlight guiding the way. "Are you coming?" he called over his shoulder. I took a deep breath, summoning what little courage I had left, and followed. The steps groaned under our weight, and the walls seemed to close in around us as we descended. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony of voices that filled my head. When we reached the bottom, the flashlight's beam revealed a small, dirt-floored room. At the center stood a crude altar, its surface covered in strange symbols and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Surrounding it were remnants of candles, their wax melted into grotesque shapes. Elliot approached the altar cautiously, his movements deliberate. He reached out and picked up a small object that lay at its center, a weathered piece of bone, carved with intricate patterns. "This isn't just a binding ritual," he said, his voice low. "It's a summoning." The word sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, the whispers reached a deafening crescendo, and the room was plunged into darkness. The flashlight flickered, its beam sputtering before cutting out completely. I stumbled backward, my breaths coming in shallow gasps as the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. The whispers had become screams, a chorus of anguish and rage that made my head throb. "Elliot!" I called out, panic lacing my voice. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Stay close." I felt his hand grasp my arm, anchoring me in the pitch-black void. The screams grew louder, more intense, until I thought I might pass out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The flashlight sputtered back to life, casting its beam across the room. The altar was gone, the symbols erased, as if they had never been there at all. Elliot looked at me, his expression unreadable. "We need to leave," he said. I didn't argue. We climbed the stairs in silence, the weight of what we had seen hanging heavy in the air. As we stepped out into the cool night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line, that whatever we had awakened was far from finished with us. The cabin door slammed shut behind us, and for the first time in hours, I felt the breeze. It wasn't the usual cool embrace of a night wind. It was sharper, angrier, like it was trying to shove me back inside, back to whatever waited in the pitch-black basement. It carried with it whispers, faint and fragile, trailing behind like echoes of a warning already too late to heed. Elliot was ahead, silent and unreadable. His flashlight's beam bobbed with his stride, cutting through the thick air but barely grazing the forest shadows around us. I hurried to catch up, clutching my notebook, though the pages within seemed now like the ravings of a madman. I glanced at the still fresh sketches, the twisting sun and the jagged lines converging on the all-seeing eye at its center. But beneath it, scrawled hastily as the flashlight flickered and hissed in the basement, was something I had no memory of drawing. "Elliot," I called, but the wind stole the words before they could reach him. We pressed on through the gnarled underbrush, every crunch underfoot sounding louder in the unnerving silence. The distance between us and the cabin grew, but its memory lingered. Something in my bones screamed this wasn't over. In the corner of my eye, the trees moved. Not swaying, not bending. Moving. Elliot stopped abruptly, kneeling to the dirt as if his legs had given way, but his calm demeanor suggested intent. I didn't have to ask what he was doing, I knew the routine. He was reading the land, tracing the small disturbances in the earth that only his trained eyes could perceive. I stood silent behind him, my mind occupied with the whispers that had danced around my ears for hours. Even now, I couldn't shake the feeling that their source wasn't distant. It was within me. "Miguel," he said, his tone sharp enough to snap me back to reality. "What? What did you find?" "Tracks. Human." "Hard to say," he muttered, tracing the outline with a gloved hand. "Too deep for an ordinary person. It's almost like the ground gave way and swallowed the step." I glanced behind me instinctively, half expecting to see figures in the shadows, feet pressing against the unstable earth and dragging themselves forward. But there was no one there. Just the wind, the trees, and the unrelenting sense of dread. "Does it lead back to the cabin?" I ventured. I regretted the question before I even asked it. Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he rose to his full height and began walking. I followed reluctantly. As we progressed, the forest grew darker. The moon had vanished entirely, and the path ahead was illuminated only by the flashlight in Elliot's hand. Its beam wavered occasionally, as if straining to hold its shape, to fight against the enveloping blackness that threatened to swallow us whole. The whispers grew louder, closer, and I began to wonder if it was the wind at all. It sounded almost human now, desperate and pleading. Elliot stopped again. This time, it wasn't to examine the ground. His flashlight cut across the space ahead, revealing a clearing that stretched out like a deep, unnatural wound in the earth. Something about the area felt profoundly wrong. It wasn't just the way the trees seemed to grow outward in jagged shapes, almost recoiling from the edges of the clearing, it was the smell. It hit me all at once, sour and metallic, mixed with something earthy and decayed. I gagged instinctively, pulling my jacket over my nose. Elliot didn't flinch. "It's here," he said quietly, as though speaking any louder would summon something we couldn't fight. "What's here?" I asked, my voice trembling. He pointed. At first, I didn't see what he meant. But as I squinted, the faint outlines of a structure began to take shape, a jagged heap of stone and wood standing defiant against the whispers that swirled around us. It wasn't an altar, not like the one in the cabin. This one was older, unrefined, and angry. Elliot stepped forward, unrelenting. I hesitated, then followed. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself was pulling me back. When we reached the edge of the clearing, Elliot stopped and gestured for me to wait. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Investigate," he said simply. "Alone?" "You've seen what we're dealing with. What's out here?" If I'm right, this isn't just about what's here. It's about what was brought here. And that requires precision. I nodded reluctantly, though I couldn't help feeling like I was abandoning him to something I couldn't comprehend. He stepped into the clearing, his flashlight slicing through the dark, and moved cautiously toward the structure. I stayed at the edge, watching and waiting, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. I clutched my notebook, flipping frantically through the pages as if the answers might somehow be written there. But the pages offered no comfort, only the jagged lines and the piercing eye, mocking me with its gaze. Elliot reached the structure and paused, his flashlight trained on its surface. From where I stood, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but his posture told me it wasn't good. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small knife, running its edge along the surface as if testing the material. And then, all at once, the world shifted. The whispers exploded into a chorus of screams, and the air turned violently against me, knocking me backward into the dirt. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and saw Elliot stagger, his flashlight falling to the ground as he braced himself against the structure. "Elliot!" I shouted, but the wind stole my voice. The darkness around the clearing began to move, twisting and roiling like smoke given form. Figures emerged from the shadows, tall, thin, and impossibly elongated. Their faces were obscured, but their presence was undeniable. Elliot turned, his eyes locking with mine, and for the first time in all our years together, I saw fear. He shouted something, words lost to the wind, and then the figures surged forward, surrounding him in a blur of motion. I didn't think. I acted. Clutching my notebook, I rushed into the clearing, the weight of the air pressing against me like 1,000 hands. The figures turned toward me, their movements jerky and unnatural, but I didn't stop. I reached Elliot and grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the structure with all the strength I could muster. "Run!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the screams. We stumbled out of the clearing, the figures close behind. The darkness roiled around us, and the whispers turned to laughter, low and guttural, echoing in my head like a twisted symphony. When we finally broke through the trees, the laughter stopped, and the forest returned to its oppressive silence. Elliot collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. I knelt beside him, my hand shaking as I gripped my notebook. The jagged line stared back at me, mocking me once again. "What was that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He looked at me, his expression grim, and said the words I'd been dreading. "It's just the beginning." The morning sun was an unwelcome intruder as it clawed its way over the horizon, painting the world in pale, grayish light that did little to banish the memories of the night before. Every inch of my body ached, though whether it was from the harrowing sprint out of the clearing or the weight of what we'd faced, I couldn't tell. Elliot had been silent for hours, his face set in an expression that could only be described as grim determination. He'd barely acknowledged me as we packed up our camp and hit the road again, leaving that cursed stretch of forest behind us. I glanced at him from the passenger seat, the tension in his jaw as rigid as the dusty road beneath our tires. His knuckles were pale against the wheel, and his eyes were fixed ahead, scanning the horizon like a hawk searching for its prey. "I hope you have a plan," I said finally, breaking the oppressive silence. Elliot's only response was a curt nod. Whatever thoughts were turning over in his mind, he wasn't ready to share them yet. Typical. The road stretched on endlessly before us, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the barren landscape. The occasional tumbleweed bounced lazily by, a stark contrast to the storm of questions and doubts swirling in my mind. My hand found its way to my notebook, flipping open to the pages I'd filled with frantic sketches and notes over the past few days. The symbol we'd found, etched into the altar, carved into the tree, glared back at me, its jagged lines a puzzle that refused to be solved. "Do you think it's tied to the disappearances?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Elliot's fingers tapped against the steering wheel, the only outward sign of the tension simmering beneath his calm facade. "It's not just about the disappearances," he said finally, his voice low. "It's about what's keeping people from finding them." I frowned, turning the words over in my mind. "You mean something's hiding them?" "Not just hiding them," he said. "Erasing them. It's like they were never there to begin with." The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I leaned back in my seat, staring out at the desolate landscape that surrounded us. There was no one else out here, no sign of life for miles. Just the road, the dust, and the empty sky. We reached the next town by mid-morning, a sleepy little place that seemed to exist on the edge of oblivion. The buildings were low and weathered, their faded paint peeling under the relentless sun. A few locals milled about, their faces worn and guarded as they went about their business. As we pulled into the dusty lot of a diner that looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the 1930s, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Elliot parked the car and turned to me, his expression serious. "You said there was someone who might know more about the legend, the storyteller." I nodded. "There's a man named John Redbird. He's Apache, one of the last keepers of the oral traditions in this area. If anyone knows the truth about the path of no return, it's him. Where can we find him? I hesitated. He's not exactly easy to find. Lives out in the hills, away from town. The locals say he doesn't take kindly to strangers. Elliot's lips quirked into a half smile, the first sign of amusement I'd seen from him all day. Good thing we're not just any strangers. He pushed open the car door and stepped out, leaving me to scramble after him. The diner's bell jingled as we entered, and the few patrons inside turned to look at us with the wary curiosity reserved for outsiders. Elliot strode to the counter with the confidence of a man who already knew what he was going to get. "Coffee." "Black," he said to the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read $*$. "And any information you have on John Redbird?" Darla raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. She poured his coffee and slid it across the counter before leaning in slightly. "You're not the first to come asking about him," she said, her voice low. "And you won't be the last. What do you know about him?" Elliot asked, his tone measured. She hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "John's been around these parts longer than most of us can remember," she said. "Knows things most folks don't. Things most folks don't want to know." "Where can we find him?" I asked, my curiosity outweighing my caution. Darla shook her head. "You don't find John. He finds you if he wants to. But if you're serious about talking to him, you'll need to head up into the hills. There's an old trail just past the edge of town. Follow it, and you might get lucky." Elliot nodded his thanks, tossing a couple of crumpled bills onto the counter before turning to leave. I followed him, my stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and unease. The trail was exactly where Darla had said it would be, a narrow, winding path that cut through the rocky hills like a scar. The air grew cooler as we ascended, the oppressive heat of the lowlands giving way to a crispness that was almost refreshing. But the higher we climbed, the more the landscape seemed to shift. The rocks took on strange, twisted shapes, and the trees grew gnarled and ancient, their branches reaching out like clawed hands. We didn't speak as we walked, the silence broken only by the crunch of our boots on the dirt path. My thoughts raced, a jumble of questions and theories that refused to settle. Who, or what, was John Redbird? And what secrets did he hold about the curse that hung over this forsaken land? When we finally reached the top of the trail, we found ourselves standing before a small, weathered cabin. Smoke curled lazily from a crooked chimney, and a wooden wind chime hung from the porch, its soft clinking carried on the breeze. Elliot stepped forward and knocked on the door, his movements deliberate and unhurried. For a moment, there was no response. Then, the door creaked open, revealing an older man with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. He was tall and lean, his long grey hair tied back in a braid. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, but there was an air of authority about him that made me straighten unconsciously. "You must be John Redbird," Elliot said, his tone polite but firm. The man's gaze shifted to me, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "You've brought a friend who listens," he said, his voice low and melodic. "That's good. Listening is the first step." He stepped aside, gesturing for us to enter. The interior of the cabin was simple but cozy, with walls lined with books and artifacts that spoke of a deep connection to the past. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. John motioned for us to sit, and we did so, the weight of the journey settling over us like a shroud. "You've come seeking answers," he said, his gaze steady. But the truth is not always easy to hear. Elliot leaned forward, his expression resolute. We need to understand the curse. The path of no return. People are disappearing, and we need to know why. John's smile faded, replaced by a solemn expression that sent a chill down my spine. The land remembers, he said. It remembers the blood that was spilled, the lives that were taken. The path is not just a place, it is a wound, a scar left by the sins of the past. His words hung heavy in the air, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his face. I felt a knot tighten in my chest, a growing certainty that we were far from the end of this journey, and that the answers we sought might come at a cost we weren't ready to pay. The fire in John Redbird's cabin had burned down to embers, its warm glow replaced by shadows that slithered along the walls as the wind outside howled like a living thing. The room seemed smaller somehow, the weight of John's words pressing down on me like a physical force. The land remembers, he had said, and in the silence that followed, the truth of his statement hung heavy in the air. Elliot leaned forward, his sharp gaze locked on John. You're saying the land itself is responsible? That it's retaliating? John's eyes, dark and inscrutable, flicked to Elliot's. Retaliation implies intent. The path is not a thinking thing. It is a wound. Wounds fester when they are not allowed to heal. And the disappearances. I interjected, my voice quieter than I intended. Are they the result of this festering? John's expression softened, just barely, as he turned to me. The path takes what it needs to maintain its balance. Those who step where they should not tread are swallowed by it. Erased. The room fell silent again, save for the crackling of the fire and the mournful wail of the wind outside. I glanced at Elliot, searching his face for any sign of how he was processing this. But his features remained unreadable, his mind a fortress I couldn't penetrate. Finally, Elliot straightened, his demeanor all business. How do we stop it? John's brow furrowed, and for the first time since we'd arrived, he looked uncertain. Stopping it may not be possible, he admitted. But you might be able to bind it. To limit its reach. How? Elliot pressed. John rose from his chair and crossed to a small wooden chest in the corner of the room. He opened it carefully, as though the contents might break under the weight of his hands, and pulled out a weathered leather-bound journal. Its edges were frayed, and the symbols etched into its cover were faint but unmistakable. My stomach churned as I realized I recognized them. He handed the journal to Elliot, who opened it and began flipping through its pages with the same intensity he gave to every new lead. I leaned over his shoulder, my eyes scanning the intricate diagrams and notes written in a language I didn't understand. The symbols were everywhere, circles, eyes, and jagged lines that seemed to radiate from a single point. They were identical to the ones we'd found etched into the tree and carved into the altar. This is a record of the binding ritual, John explained, his voice low. It's been passed down through generations, though its origin is far older than our people. It requires 3 elements, the blood of the land, the mark of the wound, and the will of the living. Elliot's eyes narrowed as he studied the page. The blood of the land. The soil, John clarified. From the site where the wound first opened. The original desecration. And the mark of the wound. I asked. The symbol you have already seen, John said. It must be recreated at the site of the binding. And the will of the living. Elliot prompted. John's gaze hardened. That is the most dangerous part. The path does not give up its power easily. It will fight to maintain its hold. The one performing the ritual must confront it directly, anchoring themselves to the physical world while standing at the edge of the other. Elliot closed the journal, his expression grim. And what happens if they fail? John didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said everything. We left the cabin as the first hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The air was cold and sharp, biting at my face as we descended the trail back to the car. The journal felt heavy in my bag, its presence a constant reminder of the task ahead. Elliot hadn't spoken since we left, his mind clearly preoccupied. I couldn't blame him. As we reached the car, I turned to him, my breath visible in the morning air. "Do you think this will work?" Elliot unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat without answering. I climbed in beside him, the silence between us stretching thin and taut. He started the engine, and the old Plymouth roared to life, breaking the stillness. "We don't have a choice," he said finally, his voice steady but low. "If there's even a chance we can stop this, we have to try." I nodded, though the knot in my stomach only tightened. The path ahead seemed impossibly daunting, and the weight of our responsibility was almost suffocating. But as much as I wanted to turn back, to leave this cursed stretch of land behind and never look back, I knew I couldn't. Not now. Not after everything we'd seen. The drive to the site John had described felt longer than it should have, the landscape blurring into an endless expanse of dust and shadows. The location was marked on an old map John had given us, a place he referred to as the first scar. It was where the desecration had begun, where the balance had first been broken. Neither of us spoke as we approached, the weight of the journal's instructions hanging heavy over us. When we arrived, the site was even more desolate than I'd imagined. The ground was cracked and dry, the soil an unnatural shade of red that seemed to glisten in the morning light. The air was heavy, thick with the same oppressive silence that had followed us since the beginning of this journey. Elliot parked the car and stepped out, his coat billowing in the wind as he surveyed the area. I followed hesitantly, clutching the journal like a lifeline. The symbol we needed to recreate was etched into my memory, but the thought of carving it into this cursed ground made my skin crawl. "Let's get to work," Elliot said, his voice breaking through my thoughts. He pulled a small spade from the trunk and handed it to me. "We'll need to dig down to find the soil for the binding." I hesitated, my gaze lingering on the unnatural red dirt beneath our feet. "And if we disturb something we shouldn't?" "We already have," Elliot said simply. "The only way out is through." With a deep breath, I knelt and began digging, the spade cutting through the dry soil with surprising ease. Elliot worked beside me, his movements precise and methodical. The wind picked up as we dug, carrying with it faint whispers that sent chills down my spine. I tried to block them out, focusing on the task at hand. When we finally unearthed the soil John had described, a dark, rich earth that seemed out of place in the barren landscape, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were holding something sacred. Or cursed. Elliot laid out the components of the ritual with meticulous care, his every movement deliberate. The soil. The journal. The symbols. Each element was placed with precision, forming a circle at the center of the site. As the wind grew stronger, the whispers turned to voices, low and guttural, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, creeping toward the circle like living things. Elliot stood at the center, his face set in determination. He glanced at me, his eyes fierce. "Whatever happens, don't break the circle. No matter what you see or hear." I nodded, clutching the journal to my chest as if it could shield me from what was to come. The ground beneath us trembled, and the voices grew louder, a cacophony of rage and despair that made my head throb. Elliot began to chant, his voice steady and resolute as he followed the words inscribed in the journal. The symbols around him seemed to come alive, glowing faintly as the energy of the ritual built. The air crackled with tension, and the shadows surged forward, colliding with the circle and recoiling as if struck. The next moments were a blur, a chaotic maelstrom of light and sound that defied logic. The shadows fought against the circle, their forms twisting and writhing as they sought to break through. The voices screamed in unison, a deafening roar that threatened to drown out Elliot's chant. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The shadows dissolved, the voices silenced. The air was still, and the circle remained intact. Elliot sank to his knees, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. I rushed to his side, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's done," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But as I looked around at the silent, empty landscape, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something we didn't yet understand. The quiet after the ritual was almost more unnerving than the chaos that had preceded it. The wind no longer howled, and the voices, the guttural whispers, the mournful cries, had vanished entirely, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt unnatural. The clearing seemed unchanged, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, like the ground beneath us was no longer the same earth we'd been standing on. Elliot remained on his knees, his breath shallow and uneven as if he'd run a marathon. His trench coat, usually pristine despite the wear and tear of his investigations, was streaked with dirt and flecks of blood from where his hands had scraped against the rough soil. I crouched beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder, unsure if the gesture would provide him any comfort. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice low but carrying the weight of the question. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the remnants of the ritual circle. The soil where the symbols had been drawn was now smooth, undisturbed, as if the markings had never existed at all. When he finally turned to me, his eyes were clouded, distant. "It worked," he said, though there was no triumph in his tone. "But it's not over." Those words sent a chill through me, colder than the night air that clung to my skin. I wanted to believe him, to trust that the ritual had sealed the path and that the horrors we'd faced were behind us. But something about the way he said it, the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, told me he didn't believe it himself. "We should leave," I said, glancing nervously at the tree line. The shadows there seemed to press closer, as if they were watching, waiting, before whatever's left decides to change its mind. Elliot nodded, pushing himself to his feet with a groan. He swayed unsteadily, and I moved to support him, looping one arm around his shoulders. For a man who usually exuded unshakable confidence, he seemed uncharacteristically vulnerable, a reminder that even he had his limits. The walk back to the car felt longer than it should have, the weight of the journal in my bag a constant reminder of what we'd just done. The path might have been bound, but the air still felt heavy, charged with an electricity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump, my mind conjuring images of the shadowy figures we'd seen in the clearing. When we finally reached the car, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Elliot slid into the driver's seat without a word, his movements sluggish but deliberate. I climbed into the passenger side, setting the journal on the dash as if putting it any closer to me would make its contents spill out and come alive. Elliot started the engine, the familiar rumble of the Plymouth breaking the oppressive silence. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow dirt path that wound its way back to the main road. I glanced over at him, his hand steady on the wheel despite the weariness in his expression. "What now?" I asked, not because I wanted to know the answer, but because the silence was unbearable. Elliot's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles white against the worn leather. "Now, we make sure it holds." The implications of those words made my stomach churn, but I didn't press him further. The truth was, I wasn't sure I wanted to know what he meant. The town was quieter than it had been when we left, though it was hard to imagine a place like this ever bustling with activity. The buildings seemed to sag under the weight of their own existence, their faded signs and peeling paint a testament to the passage of time. Even the diner, with its flickering neon sign, looked more ghostly than inviting. Elliot pulled into the parking lot but didn't turn off the engine. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, as if steeling himself for something. After a moment, he reached for the journal and flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages with the same intensity I'd seen 100 times before. "We need to find Redbird," he said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. I nodded, though the thought of going back into the hills to find the old storyteller made my skin crawl. There was something about him, his presence, his words, that had unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. But if Elliot thought he could help us finish this, I wasn't going to argue. "Do you think he'll talk to us again?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Elliot's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "He doesn't have a choice." The hike back to Redbird's cabin was even more grueling than before, the weight of exhaustion and unanswered questions pressing down on me with every step. The air grew colder as we ascended, the wind carrying with it a faint, familiar whisper that made my blood run cold. I glanced at Elliot, but his expression gave nothing away. He kept moving, his pace unrelenting, and I struggled to keep up. When we reached the cabin, the door was already open, a thin stream of smoke curling from the chimney. Redbird was waiting for us, his sharp features illuminated by the firelight as he stood in the doorway. He didn't look surprised to see us, though his gaze lingered on Elliot for a moment longer than I was comfortable with. "You've done it," he said simply, his voice low and steady. Elliot nodded, stepping past him into the cabin without waiting for an invitation. I followed hesitantly, the warmth of the fire doing little to chase away the chill that had settled deep in my bones. "It won't hold," Elliot said, his tone matter-of-fact. He set the journal on the table, flipping it open to the page with the binding ritual. "Not forever." Redbird's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, concern, maybe, or pity. "No," he said. "It won't." "Then what's the point?" I asked, unable to keep the frustration from creeping into my voice. "Why go through all of this if it's just going to come back?" "The point," Redbird said, his gaze steady, "is to buy time. Time for the land to heal. Time for the balance to be restored." Elliot leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table as he stared at the journal. "And if it doesn't? If the balance can't be restored?" Redbird didn't answer right away. He turned to the fire, his back to us, and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Then the land will take what it needs. And there will be nothing left to stop it." The weight of his words settled over us like a shroud, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. I glanced at Elliot, hoping he might offer some reassurance, some plan to stop this madness once and for all. But his expression remained unreadable, his eyes fixed on the journal as if it held the answers we were searching for. Finally, he stood, his movements deliberate. "We're not done," he said, his voice firm. "Not yet." Redbird turned to face him, his expression inscrutable. The path is bound. For now, that is enough. For now, Elliot repeated, his tone hard. He picked up the journal and turned to leave, his coat swirling around him like a shadow. I followed, my heart heavy with the weight of what we'd just heard. As we stepped out into the cold night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking away from one battle only to face another. The path might have been bound, but the shadows still lingered, and I knew, deep down, that they always would. The car ride back was cloaked in a suffocating silence. Elliot gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as if it would dissolve should he glance away. I sat beside him, the journal heavy in my lap, its worn leather cover pressing against me like a burden I couldn't ignore. The words John Redbird had spoken lingered in the air between us, more potent than the smoke curling from Elliot's occasional cigarette. "It's not over." The phrase rang in my ears, over and over, each repetition louder and more insistent than the last. The wind clawed at the car as we sped along the highway, the barren landscape stretching endlessly on either side. Even now, after the ritual, the world didn't feel right. Something in the air had shifted, something imperceptible yet undeniably present. "Are you just going to drive in circles until you figure this out?" I asked finally, my voice breaking through the tension like a sharp blade. Elliot exhaled a plume of smoke, his grip on the wheel tightening. "I'm thinking." "You've been thinking for miles," I said, frustrated. "And nothing's changed." He shot me a glance, the sharpness in his gaze silencing me for a moment. "It's not just about finding answers, Miguel. It's about staying ahead." "Ahead of what?" I demanded. "The shadows? The whispers? The things out there that want us dead?" Elliot didn't respond immediately. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost resigned. "Ahead of what's coming." Those words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't press further. Elliot wasn't the kind of man to elaborate unless he wanted to, and I knew better than to push him when he was like this. Instead, I opened the journal, flipping to the page with the binding ritual, the intricate diagrams and instructions glaring up at me like some ancient prophecy. "We still have work to do," Elliot said suddenly, his voice breaking through my thoughts. I looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "The ritual's done." He shook his head, his eyes never leaving the road. "The path is bound, but the land is still bleeding. Until we find a way to stop that, nothing's really over." I stared at him, unsure whether to be angry or terrified. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Elliot didn't answer, his expression unreadable as the car tore down the highway. I turned back to the journal, the weight of his words pressing down on me as I tried to make sense of what we'd done, and what was left to do. We reached the edge of the scarred land just as the sun began to set, its golden rays casting long shadows across the barren earth. The site of the ritual was unchanged, the ground smooth and unbroken, yet the air was thick with a tension that made my skin crawl. Elliot parked the car and stepped out, his trench coat billowing in the wind as he scanned the horizon. I followed reluctantly, clutching the journal like a talisman. "What are we doing here?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the wind. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He moved toward the center of the site, his footsteps steady and deliberate, as if he were walking into the jaws of some unseen beast. When he reached the spot where the circle had been drawn, he knelt and pressed his hand to the earth, his fingers sifting through the soil with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "The land remembers," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But it doesn't forget." I frowned, unsure what he meant. "You think it's still alive?" even after the ritual?" Elliot nodded, his eyes fixed on the ground beneath us. "It's not just alive. It's angry." Before I could respond, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the clearing, carrying with it faint whispers that made my blood run cold. I froze, my eyes darting to the tree line, but the shadows there remained still. Elliot didn't flinch, his focus unbroken as he traced the outline of the invisible circle. "We need to find the source," he said, his voice firm. "The place where the desecration began." "And how do we do that?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "We listen." The wind carried us forward, its whispers growing louder with each step we took. The land seemed to shift beneath our feet, the barren earth giving way to jagged rocks and twisted trees that reached out like skeletal hands. Elliot led the way, his movements purposeful and unyielding, while I struggled to keep up, my heart pounding in my chest. We reached the edge of a ravine, its jagged cliffs plunging into darkness. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Elliot stood at the precipice, his gaze fixed on the abyss below. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. I stared at him, my mind racing. "What do you mean, this is it?" "There's nothing down there but darkness." Elliot didn't respond. He stepped closer to the edge, his trench coat billowing in the wind, and knelt to examine the ground. The soil here was different, darker, richer, as if it had been stained by something unnatural. I hesitated, then moved to join him, my pulse pounding in my ears. The journal felt heavier in my hands, its contents a mystery I wasn't sure I wanted to unravel. But as I opened it to the page with the binding ritual, the symbols seemed to come alive, glowing faintly in the fading light. "We need to go down there," Elliot said suddenly, his voice breaking through my thoughts. I stared at him, incredulous. "Are you insane?" "We don't even know what's down there." "That's the point," he said, his gaze unwavering. "We need to find out." I wanted to argue, to tell him that this was madness, that we were pushing our luck too far. But the determination in his eyes silenced me, and I nodded reluctantly, my heart heavy with dread. The descent into the ravine was slow and treacherous, the jagged rocks threatening to tear at our clothes with every step. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became a chorus of screams that echoed off the cliffs and rattled in my skull. I clutched the journal, my hands trembling, as Elliot led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. When we reached the bottom, the air was thick with a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The ground was uneven, littered with fragments of stone and bone that seemed to glisten in the dim light. At the center of the ravine was a twisted structure, a mass of roots and stone that pulsed with an unnatural energy. Elliot approached it cautiously, his movements deliberate. I followed hesitantly, the journal clutched tightly to my chest. As we neared the structure, the whispers became a single voice, low and guttural, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Elliot didn't answer. He reached out to touch the structure, his fingers brushing against its surface. The air crackled with tension, and the ground beneath us trembled. "This is where it began," he said, his voice steady. "This is the wound." Before I could respond, the structure pulsed violently, and the world around us exploded into chaos. Shadows surged forward, colliding with the light of Elliot's flashlight, and the voices became screams, deafening and relentless. Elliot shouted something, but his words were lost in the cacophony. I stumbled backward, my vision blurred, as the shadows closed in. The journal slipped from my grasp, falling to the ground as I fought to stay upright. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The shadows dissolved, the screams silenced, and the ravine was still. Elliot sank to his knees, his breath ragged. I rushed to his side, my heart racing as I looked around at the empty, desolate landscape. "It's not done," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet." I stared at him, my mind reeling. The path might have been bound, but the land's fury was far from quenched. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. The ravine had faded into the rearview mirror, swallowed by distance and shadows, but the weight of it lingered like a brand on my chest. The car hummed its steady tune, but the silence inside the cabin pressed heavier than ever. Elliot stared straight ahead, his jaw locked and his hands gripping the wheel like it was the only thing tethering him to this world. His trench coat hung heavy over his frame, streaked with the dirt and ash of the ritual's aftermath. I hadn't seen him like this, so utterly worn down, so distant, and it scared me more than the shadows ever could. I let my gaze wander out the window. The landscape was barren, the sun dipping low and painting everything in fiery reds and oranges. The dying light stretched across the horizon like some ancient warning, too vivid to ignore. The journal sat closed in my lap, its presence a cold comfort. I ran my fingers along its cracked leather surface, trying to focus on the texture, the realness of it, instead of the feeling of inevitability clawing at the edges of my mind. "You're quiet," Elliot said, breaking the silence like splintered glass. I blinked, startled out of my thoughts. "You say that like it's unusual." "It is." His voice was low, measured, the sound of a man caught between worlds. "You've always got something to say." I looked at him, searching his face for any flicker of emotion beyond the grim determination that had consumed him. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "That was something I'm not sure I'll ever be able to explain." "You don't have to explain it," he said. "You just have to accept it." The words hit me harder than I expected. Accept it. As if it were that simple. As if we hadn't just stared into the void and barely come out alive. The car slowed as Elliot pulled off the highway, the tires crunching over gravel as we came to a stop by the roadside. He turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. He didn't move to get out, instead sitting there, staring at the horizon, his expression unreadable. "Why are we stopping?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Elliot didn't look at me. "Because this isn't done." I froze, the air catching in my lungs. "What are you talking about?" "We did the ritual. We bound the path. We." "It's not enough," he interrupted, his voice hard. "You know it as well as I do. The land's still bleeding, Miguel. And until it stops, people are going to keep disappearing." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that we'd done everything we could. But the truth sat heavy in my chest, undeniable. He was right. The shadows, the whispers, they hadn't gone. They were still out there, lurking just beyond the edges of sight and sound. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Elliot turned to me, and for the first time, I saw the resolve in his eyes falter. "We end it." We walked into the dying light, leaving the car behind as we ventured deeper into the landscape. The horizon stretched wide and empty, the earth cracked and dry beneath our feet. The air was heavy, oppressive, and every step felt like a battle against the pull of something unseen. Elliot led the way, his movements purposeful, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "What do you mean by intended?" I asked, struggling to keep pace with him. He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost fragile. "The wound can't heal while the path still exists. It's a scar that keeps tearing open, no matter how many times we try to close it." "And how do we mend a scar?" I asked, the frustration creeping into my tone. Elliot stopped suddenly, turning to face me. His expression was grave, his eyes dark. "We destroy it." I stared at him, my mind racing. "You mean the site? The place where it all began?" "Yes," he said. "If we destroy the source, we might be able to stop this. For good." "But how?" I demanded. "We barely survived the ritual. What makes you think we can do this?" Elliot's gaze softened, just barely. "Because we have to." I wanted to argue, to tell him this was madness, that we were playing with forces we couldn't hope to understand. But the resolve in his eyes silenced me. This wasn't about what we wanted or what we feared. It was about what needed to be done. The source was waiting for us. The structure at the center of the ravine pulsed with an unnatural energy, its jagged roots and twisted stone reaching out like the claws of some ancient beast. The air crackled with tension, and the voices, the whispers, the screams, rose to a deafening crescendo as we approached. Elliot didn't hesitate. He stepped into the circle, his trench coat billowing in the wind, his movements deliberate. He reached into his bag and pulled out the journal, flipping to the page that held the key to ending this nightmare. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. "Stay outside the circle," he said, his tone firm. "No matter what happens, don't break it." I nodded, my heart pounding as I watched him begin the ritual. The symbols came alive under his hands, glowing faintly in the dim light as he traced them into the dirt. The shadows surged forward, colliding with the circle and recoiling, their forms twisting and writhing as they fought against the binding. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, and the ground beneath us trembled. Elliot's voice rose above the chaos, steady and resolute, as he chanted the words that would seal the path forever. And then, all at once, the world exploded into light. The shadows screamed, their forms disintegrating as the circle blazed with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The ground cracked beneath us, the earth splitting open as the source was consumed by the ritual's power. I stumbled backward, my vision blurred, as the landscape dissolved into chaos. When the light finally faded, the ravine was silent. Elliot stood at the center of the circle, his trench coat tattered and his face streaked with dirt and ash. He looked at me, his eyes weary but victorious, and I felt a flicker of hope for the first time since this nightmare began. "It's done," he said, his voice barely audible. I stepped forward, my heart heavy with the weight of everything we'd lost and everything we'd gained. The land was still, the air clean, and the shadows were gone. For now. As we walked away from the ravine, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and red. The world felt new, reborn, as if the weight of the path had finally been lifted. Elliot looked at me, his expression softer than I'd seen in years. "Let's go home." I nodded, the words catching in my throat as I followed him back to the car. The forgotten highway was behind us, its scars fading into the distance. But its echoes would linger forever, etched into the land, the sky, and our souls. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey into the heart of mystery and terror with The Forgotten Highway. Though the story may end, its echoes will remain, leaving us to ponder the fragile balance between our world and the unknown. If you enjoyed this tale, be sure to stay tuned for more gripping stories coming soon to BookBound Audio. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to never miss a single tale. Until next time, let the stories guide you.